All right. Thank you so much to the class and for everyone in the youth for having me. As my introductory team said, my name is Hudson Kingston. I am legal director at Cure. Since I am a lawyer, my presentation is a downer. Hurdles and pitfalls on the road to Solarpunk Duluth. So I've been asked to talk about policy, and I find that the best way to understand this is through history. So I've called it History and Policy. Cure, if you haven't heard of us, is an organization that protects and restores resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of the people who care about them. So we have a really strong emphasis on rural communities, a really strong emphasis on democracy, democratization of environmental issues, and on things like rural electric co-ops, which are generally understood to be democratically run electric companies, although they don't always act that way. So we have a really strong emphasis on participatory democracy in working on environmental problems, and that does make us sort of a unique rural voice in the environmental discussion. But enough about me, enough about Cure. We are here to talk about Solarpunking Duluth, and I would like to start, because this is a law talk, with a quote from the Supreme Court and Oliver Wendell Holmes. A page of history is worth a volume of logic, which I always just thought was very well put. And also, as you can tell from his mustache, he would be a solar punk if he was here today. So I'm starting in 1893. That's how committed I am to the idea of this being history. And I'm starting with a quote from Charles Dudley Warner. "We are quite in the electric way. We boast that we have made electricity our slave, but the slave whom we do not understand is our master, and before we know him, we shall be transformed." So at the time, Charles Dudley Warner, good friend of Mark Twain, sort of a witty guy of his day, was not super into the whole electrification thing that was going on in America, as you can tell from these lines. In fact, he sort of calls out Mr. Edison as being kind of the Elon Musk of his day, if you will, and says, "Mr. Edison proposes to send us over the country at a rate of 100 miles an hour. Mr. Edison should turn his attention from physics to humanity electrically considered in its social condition." And although that's complicatedly written, I would also argue that he is a solar punk at heart. Unfortunately, this is 130 years ago, and the world we live in now is very much Thomas Edison's and not so much Charles Dudley Warner's, as much as we still remember both of them to some extent. In the past 130 years, plus a few because they were doing it when in 1893, we have built what is called the world's largest machine, and that is the electrical grid across North America. It is the biggest human-made machine in history, bar none, and it stretches from coast to coast, and it's one big, not quite living and breathing, but definitely evolving and changing system that gets updated here and tweaked there, and it fails here. There's a blackout there, there's a brownout there. And it's based around this theory that you can build giant power plants and giant transmission lines and to bring power to places like Duluth, where then it is put in a distribution grid and served up to customers, be they industrial customers, be they entire cities could be a customer of this system, or directly to residents like people who are getting electricity from Minnesota Power here in Duluth. So it's really three big steps. The generation plants, build them as big as you can and you'll make more money. The power lines, build them as big as you can, leave them up for as long as you can and you'll make more money. And then make sure that you have as many customers as you can so you can spread that cost over a large number of people and raise your annual rate of return. Nationally, residential electric service has existed for this more than 100 years period, and it really started in urban areas. So it started very much in New York City and places like that, and then moved to places like the Twin Cities. But rural America really could be, was not important enough, not worth the investment for these for-profit companies. And it was only in 1936 when Congress passed the Rural Electrification Act that there was this huge revolution, and what had already been a pretty profitable and expanding business really went gangbusters for the next approximately 50 years, I guess 40 to 50 years, because at that point, Congress had set up this very beneficial system to create the rural electric co-op system and to get electricity out to the majority of the country that had not been served by electric service before that. So through the late 1960s, it was exponential growth in both profits for these companies and in greenhouse gases emitted, right? They were just building a power plant, building a transmission line, finding more customers, building a power plant, building a transmission line, finding more customers. And then in the 1970s, there were the oil and energy shocks. Some of these companies built power plants that were unnecessary, and everyone got really angry and concerned about a system that's going out of control and is only built on exponential growth. And at that time, people understood that something had to change. And what kept happening, even though things had changed and did change to some extent in the 70s, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, they kept building the world's largest machine. So I had that first diagram that sort of showed how it works in terms of the different parts of the machine. This is just part of that one entity that covers all of North America. And we are in the green one, the Midwest Independent System Operator. As you all know from the 2021 disaster in Texas, Texas has its own little ISO called ERCOT. And then everyone in between is fed electricity, if they can pay for it, from this interconnected grid. The West here doesn't have an ISO, but trust me, they have electric companies there. It's just a weird thing about the way the regulations don't work differently there. So we're coming a lot closer. In the last 50 years, since the 1970s or so, Minnesota has had a regulated monopoly model for power generation, transmission, and distribution. So we allow monopolies to handle all stages of the system. You go to Illinois, you go to New York, you go to Texas, they don't have that. So they have a deregulated system where you as a customer can go to this company or that company and buy electricity from either one of them. You can make that choice, which sounds good, but often doesn't work out very well for the customers. But in Minnesota, it's pure monopoly. Each power utility has the exclusive right to serve a service territory. So if you live in Duluth, your company is Minnesota Power. You don't get to make a choice on that. They've already made that choice for you. Going off grid, which is still an option. A lot of people, I live up in the Ely area. A lot of people I know live in off grid houses. It can be costly for sure still. Risky, less and less so, but certainly in the 70s it was pretty risky. And requires rethinking normal energy-dependent U.S. lifestyle. We are all pretty addicted to large amounts of cheap energy, and I realize that when I'm talking to people who live in an off-grid house and the types of choices they currently make in order to make that work. And they're very happy with their systems. It's just very different from how most of us live. So those who know that Minnesota was at the center of the big transition in the 1970s. And this is best exemplified in my mind by the book Powerline by Paul Wellstone and Barry Casper, or rather Powerline, The First Battle of America's Energy War. And this was about a coal plant that was being built in North Dakota to serve co-op customers up here in the Arrowhead mostly. And it was about a bunch of, actually it connected to the Twin Cities. So the farmers were truly angry that it was a power line being built through their farm fields to serve an urban area. But the companies proposing it were up here, details you didn't need to know. And it was a huge mass mobilization effort. You know, it was a national news story. They made for TV movies about it, romances, I believe. There were buttons and posters. They had really good art, and there were huge nonviolent protests and then a few violent ones when the farmers were not listened to and were not very happy with a system that was going to build this power line, whether the people who were going to be impacted wanted it or not. And for those who are too young to know him well, Paul Wellstone went on from being this author of this book to being a professor at Carleton College and a U.S. Senator for the state of Minnesota. And unfortunately was taken too soon for him to do all the great things that he was going to do. But read this book if you can. Much like that long and hard to read quote from Charles Dudley Warren, I'm going to try another one from Paul Wellstone and Barry Casper. So this is written in 1980. Taking advantage of its network of cooperatives that reach into every rural community, the new REA could arrange for long-term low-interest loans to finance nationwide experiment in decentralized energy. Federal monies would go into tightening rural homes, and the resourcefulness of rural citizens would be channeled into developing new ideas in energy conservation and renewable resources that would benefit the entire nation. I'm telling you, these guys were Solarpunk too, way before the term was coined. And it's a great book. It covers so many of the issues we're still talking about today. They have this reasonable proposal where they're saying within the system we have now, we could start fixing the problems that we know we have. But as you probably guessed, again, at this important pivot point, the system just sort of kept moving along, and the proposal of this book largely was not heeded. So now we're getting to the present. This is my first slide, our electric past present. The system we have now still incentivizes really big infrastructure that gets utilities a guaranteed rate of return. So if they build a power plant, they have to ask the regulators permission. The regulators say, sure, go ahead and build that power plant. The company knows exactly how much money it's going to make for the next 30 years, right? Because it knows how much it spent on that thing. It knows how much energy it's going to spend. All of that is guaranteed profit for a monopoly. There's really in those incentives that are like how we run the system, there's no natural incentive for resilience, small scale generation, energy conservation. All of those things take money away from the utility. So we have laws in Minnesota that try to get them more towards things like energy conservation and towards, for example, adopting renewable energy. And the utilities always meet what they're supposed to. They always get exactly the right amount of renewable energy, but they don't do a lot more than that in most cases. So we have a system that's really still incentivizes gigantic infrastructure development over things that are small solutions that are more beneficial, I would argue, to the community. So currently, our electricity is provided by legal monopolies with an exclusive right to provide power. All of you know about rooftop solar, so there's an asterisk on exclusive. You can generate your own energy, you can go off grid, you can put solar panels on your house and connect them to the grid because there are these programs where the utilities are to some extent forced to allow you to do that. And connected distributed energy resources, or DER, as I'm going to call them, are still interconnected and overseen by the utility monopolies. So like in Excel territory down in the Twin Cities, I was happy to be able to get solar panels on my house, and they hooked it up relatively quickly. But in another neighborhood, you could wait for 2 years because there's not enough places. Excel doesn't really want to put in a new transformer. It's not like just because you have solar panels, you'll actually get to use them. And to some extent, these monopolists get to make that decision. This diagram, which I stole from EPA, is really similar to the power plant, transmission lines, distribution lines, but if you squint, I didn't know how big the screen would be. There are little solar panels on a lot of the buildings. So there's a little bit of distributed energy generation. So just what's going on today. I don't know how many people in the class already came up with these examples. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but folks may know about this project in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, where a local group of environmentally minded people said to the municipal utility, so the utility that sells electricity to the people who live in Grand Rapids, they said, we have this great idea, you guys should build a giant solar plant, build a giant battery, it will save you money, it will decarbonize the electricity we get, it's gonna be great. 6 years of fighting later, Minnesota Power built it, Minnesota Power owns it, and it still benefits the people in Grand Rapids. They still get the electricity from this plant, but because of the way that the contract between Grand Rapids' municipal utility and Minnesota Power's works, there was this all-out battle about who was going to own it and who was going to control it and who was going to end up with the money. And Minnesota Power won that argument. I mean, this article about it in Energy News Network is conciliatory and says, well, it took us 6 years and we didn't get what we want, but they built a bigger solar farm than we were going to get. So maybe it's for the best. I think there are a lot of angry people who don't think it's for the best, but they did get some solar panels in their community. Similarly, down in the Twin Cities, Xcel Energy, our biggest energy utility, wants to own and sell other people microgrids and storage opportunities. So they have these resiliency hubs, which they were going to do, and then they said, or they didn't get as much money as they wanted from their regulator, so they said, we're going to take our game and go home. And then they got money from the federal government, so they're like, okay, we'll do the resiliency hubs again. But they're putting big batteries at specific community centers, and those, in the case of power outages, those big batteries will be great and useful and keep the lights on at those important key locations. Xcel is going to own them. The community centers don't get to own them, but to some extent, not everyone is an expert in running a gigantic battery, so it's nice to have someone who actually knows how to run it. Perhaps more relevant to our discussion, they're also talking about being a service provider of microgrids. So like if a hospital or the University of Minnesota or a big industrial site wants to have their own generation, their own storage, their own way to keep the lights on or manage their energy use over the day, Xcel wants to sell that to them in addition to being their utility company. And a lot of the independent solar companies in the Twin Cities have a big problem with that, because having to compete against a utility, a monopoly that has way better information than you, is always a losing game. So there's an active debate about whether we should have all of these cool distributed energy resources owned by the people who are using them, owned by the community centers that are installing them, or just continue with the monopoly model that we've been using this whole time. And the monopolies have put in their vote. Another cool example, and is really in the eye of the beholder, is where you can see all of these yellow dots are solar power plants, according to the Energy Information Administration. You can see they're all clustered around the Twin Cities. There's one above Duluth and one below it. Minnesota Power has one solar garden, one, owned by Minnesota Power. If you go on their site, they'll say it's subscribed. You can get on a waiting list if you would like to join the one solar garden. The data I had that was like from 2018, Xcel had like 180 solar gardens and counting, and providing like 880 megawatts of power, like an insane number. And so solar gardens are very big in Minnesota. We only recently lost out in solar gardens to New York State. Now it has more than we do, but we used to be the leader, and they were only around the Twin Cities because we have a law that only required Xcel to allow solar gardens. Minnesota Power was never subject to that law, so they had their one that they own themselves. And it's sort of a fig leaf of a solar garden, right? Because it's not community owned, it's not necessarily close to where you live, if anywhere in the Minnesota Power Service territory. So it's an interesting visual, like geographic demonstration of how policy can drive actual huge changes in land use and in the energy landscape just by having a law that applies to one company and not the other. So here we are, we're gonna solve our problems. Cities like Duluth don't have their own municipal utility like they have in Grand Rapids, but they do have something. And what that is called is a franchise agreement. And the franchise agreement says to Minnesota Power, hey, you would like to put poles on my street. I own the street, I'm the city of Duluth. So in order to have use of my public right of way and put in your poles and your electrical what have yous, you're gonna pay me a regular amount of money, and we're gonna renegotiate this contract on a regular basis, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 20 years. But importantly, the city owns the streets and continues to own the streets. Duluth also, as I think a lot of people know, has a municipal utility that doesn't provide electricity, but it does manage water, sewer, the streets, and the gas. And as folks may know, there is already now a legislative goal to totally decarbonize all of Minnesota's economy and all of Minnesota activities to net zero by 2050. So Comfort Systems, the company that provides gas to Duluthians, is going to have to stop providing gas by at least 2050, preferably sooner than that. So what can they do? How can comfort systems evolve? Certainly they can continue to provide water, sewer, and streets. Everybody likes that. We have to decide what kind of solution we want for Duluth. Do we want to allow the monopolies to own and do everything, including distributed energy resources? Do we want a middle path approach, or do we want to burn it all to the ground and start again from scratch? What do you think? Okay, a round of applause for option number 1, monopolization. I did talk really positively about that. Okay, for number 3, burn it to the ground. Oh, I thought I'd get some burn it to the grounds. Okay, how about the middle path? Okay. You guys anticipated where I'm going. Let's talk about the middle path. Although burning it to the ground would work, it would be very uncomfortable. So the current options in Duluth are use the leverage of the franchise agreement to start a conversation with Minnesota Power. This has happened in cities like Boulder, Colorado, and actually in Minneapolis to some extent, where the cities have started saying, like, if you don't start doing things our way, we're going to kick you out. We can make you take down these poles. We can make you stop occupying public spaces. Boulder got a lot farther than Minneapolis did, but in both cases, the cities got pretty big concessions from Xcel Energy, and they're pretty happy with where they landed, even though they never actually kicked Xcel out. At the same time as working with Minnesota Power to re-equalize the relationship, Comfort Systems can start moving away from gas supplying entirely and instead work on things like financing DER, hosting DER, using public buildings or public spaces, managing city microgrids, working with the university at UMD to create a big microgrid up there, being a sustainability provider across the board, helping people to get rain gardens, to get livable homes in all sorts of ways. And then coordinating energy democracy with public spaces and housing development. And what I mean by that is, Duluth has some of the greatest parks and open spaces of any city in the world. So why not have someone like Comfort Systems coordinating development around the great things that are here and making sure there's adequate housing and energy for the people who live here. In the future, Comfort Systems could work within the existing regulatory system and with Minnesota Power to increase homegrown energy and heating solutions that rely more on distributed energy resources instead of fracked fossil gas and huge power plants hooked up into huge power lines. I would argue that Comfort Systems doing that could insist on community and municipal ownership and control, so true democracy, rather than allowing the utility to maintain its position. A lot of people in this debate want to electrify everything and they want to get everything fixed as quickly as possible. And it's very easy to just say, let's let the utilities do it. It's undemocratic, it's capitalism, it's the fastest way we know to do anything. But Duluth has the opportunity and the option to do it the slow and messy way, using democracy, which I think in some ways is a good way to do anything. And in conclusion, I would just say we can either continue to rely on monopolists with profit motive that leads to gas plants like NTEC and coal-burning biomass plants like Hibbard, or we can move to a decentralized system that still has a place for utilities as experts and service providers. We are again clearly at a turning point, just like in 1893, just like in the late 70s, early 80s, and something has to change. So the question is, which way will it change?